Hi, my name is Cindee Moyer, and I am the current president of NIADA. I created this program for NIADA's 60th anniversary of their first conference, which was held in the summer of 1963. I'm going to share the work of every artist who has been elected to NIADA since that day. Each of these artists has her own distinctive style. There are no best dolls. The work of one is outstanding for elegance of manner, one for great emotional power, one for a strongly projected personality, and another for sympathetic understanding of the subject. As we travel through, you will notice early techniques that have evolved into even more individualized and artistic designs, and you will see the expansion of Helen's vision as it reaches around the world. I want to thank Helen Bullard for her authoritative works on early American artist dolls. Much of the information I will share with you today comes directly from books she's written on the subject and her own quotes. And to Shelley Thornton for the tremendous amount of work she did on the last 2 volumes of the Art Doll book, which has proved invaluable to me as I compiled this. Helen's vision. In 1951, Helen discovered the work of Gertrude Florian, Avis Lee, and Fawn Zeller at UFDC. Studying their work, she realized she had stumbled into a new field of art. In 1953, Helen wrote her first article on artist dolls for Doll News, the UFDC Quarterly. In 1957, Helen wrote the first of 9 monographs on artist dolls for the Toy Trader, presenting a definitive account of each artist's work. In 1962, unable to get permission from UFDC to put on a small exhibition of their work, Helen rented a small parlor for 3 hours for $11. Artists present were Helen, Maggie Head, Hallie Blakely, Gertrude Florian, and Fawn Zeller. A few weeks later, Helen wrote to Louise Cochran and said, "I think the time has come for creative doll making to come of age and to be recognized as a definite field." With the enthusiastic cooperation of Louise, Gertrude Florian, and Maggie Head, Helen offered a plan for organizing the group. On Sunday morning, May 12, 1963, Helen Bullard invited Gertrude Florian, Fawn Zeller, and Maggie Head to her home in Ozone, Tennessee, where they gather on the stone dock at the edge of her pond to discuss forming the National Institute of American Doll Artists, known today as NIADA. NIADA's founders were Helen Bullard, Gertrude Florian, Maggie Head, and Fawn Zeller. Recognized as the pioneer of the American doll artist movement, Helen's all-wood hand-carved dolls are sculpted in horse chestnut wood. Gertrude's ceramic compositions used her own secret formula, which she developed to accomplish a lifelike skin tone. Maggie began sculpting in red riverbank clay and then began sculpting and mold making for ceramics. Fawn was a pioneer in direct sculpt porcelain, working the clay on a marble slab she compared to making chocolate. Charter members of NIADA were Hallie Blakely, Muriel Breyer, Louise Cochran, Gwen Flather, Dorothy Heiser, Grace Lathrop, Gladys McDowell, Louis Sorensen, Martha Thompson, and Ellery Thorpe. Hallie began making little cloth dolls during the Depression with watercolor painted faces and yarn wigs. She later hand-carved dolls with composition heads and mohair wigs. She ultimately used high-fired clay with a cold finish of her own devising. Muriel created heirloom portraits of contemporary little girls from their photographs, as well as hundreds of dolls after famous paintings, historical and fictional characters, as well as little creatures of fun and fantasy. Creating genuine play dolls, Louise is the exception to creating dolls meant especially for exhibition and adult enjoyment. Beginning with America's Children or portrait dolls, they evolved into lookalikes, and finally her grow-up dolls, which showed the changing shape and appearance of 3 girls and 2 boys at different ages. The lifelike proportions of her doll body resulted in the first realistically constructed character doll manufactured in the United States. Gwen began experimenting with cloth dolls, studying every example she could find. Her effort to bring a sculptural quality to the little flat cloth faces resulted in her artistic technique of needle sculpting. Essentially an historical portrait artist, Dorothy Heiser made queens by the dozen, great ladies and famous men from their portraits, giving them a third dimension with her skilled fingers and trained eyes. Using the simplest materials, cloth, wire, and paint, she developed a distinctive technique and a mastery of her chosen materials. Grace was also a portrait painter. Her dolls were sculpted, molded, and painted, and because of a long interest in costuming, her first dolls were queens, dressed in fine materials with great elegance and authenticity. After not so successful attempts at cloth dolls, Gladys found a half can of wax in her husband's radio parts and began working in beeswax, ultimately creating original dolls and restoring antique wax dolls. Louis began his work in dipped wax over composition. Later they were all poured wax. His own special wax composition withstands all weather, even freezing. Martha Thompson's attention to detail is described in an account of her painting the cheeks. I am allowed to go down to the basement once every week or 10 days and stir up the air compressor and coax the airbrush along into blowing the color on all the cheeks fired since the last blowing. This is a job that needs alternate praying, cussing, and wheedling, as my fine Thayer and Chandler Model A portrait airbrush is definitely not intended to be used with sticky oil paint. Ellery had been creating original ceramic figurines of child at play, when one day a little boy's head dropped off, and unwilling to see a nice head wasted, she said to herself, "Why not make a doll?" She did, and never went back to figurines. Tamara began by making papier-mâché masks. Later, visiting with some young artists about Impressionism, she thought, wouldn't it be fun to make a doll after a Renoir painting? And so she did. Even more than the period costume, she strived to portray the character, the spirit of the times, and the era in which the subject lived. Tamara exhibited at the first NIADA exhibition as a newly elected artist member. On August 13, 1963, the first NIADA exhibition was held at the UFDC convention in Los Angeles. Helen writes, "Down the center of the large and beautiful room stretched a long table with a pale green runner strewn with pink rosebuds. On this we arranged one or more dolls from each of the absent members. Around the walls were tables for each of the artists present: Deweese Cochran, Ellery Thorpe, Maggie Head, Fawn Zeller, Louis Sorensen, newly elected Tamara Steinheil, Hallie Blakely, and myself. Most of their 21 patrons acted as hostesses to handle the crowd of more than 400 visitors." People would comment on the dolls and say, "They're beautiful, but where do you get the heads?" Artist dolls were simply unknown. They needed to explain what they were offering. 60 years later, and it seems like we're still explaining. The exhibition gave everyone the opportunity to see the variety of concepts and approaches to the doll as an art form, created for museums and collectors and not for children's play. The exhibitions became an annual feature of the United Federation of Doll Clubs. Helen's first book, The American Doll Artist, was published in 1965 and spread their story as well as generated a lot of interest because it made available for the first time the extent of their art and its seriousness. Helen's foresight to inform the public about artist dolls and to maintain an accurate record of the artist and her work has provided us with a valuable resource that we continue to build upon today. These figures were composed in the same way a painting or a piece of sculpture is composed, and follow the classic rules for a work of art. No two artists see the same things, nor do they express their ideas about them in the same manner. Leda worked in both bisque and porcelain and made both kits and finished dolls of her sculpts. Fern was noted for creating outstanding historical and theatrical dolls with costume assistance from her Aunt Bessie McGee. From modeling clay to carved wood to sculpted cloth dolls, Suzanne worked in ceramic modeling and molding before switching to porcelain. Sharon began by painting portraits, and at her mother's suggestion, she tried to model a doll. She knew she needed better materials, but couldn't find any help on how to model dolls. Her mother discovered that Maggie Head was teaching a course in modeling and mold making, so Sharon took the week-long course where they worked from 9 to 9, cramming every bit of information and practice possible into each day. Ultimately, Sharon sculpted the heads, arms, and legs of her dolls, and her mother made the cloth bodies and costuming. As a child, Pat made and dressed dolls using old catalogs and wallpaper sample books to create paper families. Later, she raided her grandmother's rag bag, progressing to cloth dolls with real dresses. When they proved inadequate as fashion mannequins, she carved figures of wood. She began making dolls from wood and ceramic clays, then wax, paper mache, cloth, and even apple heads, settling on porcelain because of the molded replicas possible in this fine material. Goody made all bisque dolls. Many were inspired by old paper doll drawings of Grace Dayton. Her dolls typically had shoulder and hip joints and swivel neck heads with glass Google eyes. Astrid discovered artist dolls while browsing in a doll shop. She bought a portrait doll and years later learned it had been made by Louise Cochran. Astrid sculpted in clay and ceramics and had studied mold making. Her dolls were created with all movable parts. Diana's first great interest was in modeling horses, but discovered the doll after attending UFDC conventions with her mother. Copies of her first doll, Miss Unity, were sold to benefit the UFDC quarterly magazine, Doll News. She later studied porcelain molding and china painting. She submitted a doll head she was working on for the 1967 UFDC convention and was commissioned to make 1,000 of them in porcelain to be used as souvenirs. Betty devised a technique of casting boiled tissue paper in a plaster mold. She used German blown glass eyes and oil painted the flesh and features. Wee Paulson's sturdy felt dolls are built on wire armatures so that they can be posed. She cut each doll and animal directly from the material with no pattern at all. She seldom used a ruler, relying on her own sense of scale. Absently rolling spilled breadcrumbs into a little old vase, his dinner partner exclaimed, "You should do that for a living." Thus the inspiration for Bernie's prize-winning breadcrumb couple. Since breadcrumbs have limited possibilities, he searched for a second medium, which was needle-sculpted cotton with a silk stocking skin. His favorite subjects were old people whose wrinkles and character lines could be suggested in his sculptured cotton faces. Inspired to create dolls of actresses and actors in costumes of their leading roles, came after a summer spent at a drama festival. Using her training in costume design and sculpture, Frances chose needle-sculpted fabric as a medium. Mary's doll was made in high-fire clay, china painted, and refired. The body is stuffed cloth over a wire armature. This is the only available record of her work. Madeline had her own studio teaching drawing and portrait painting while experimenting with dolls of wood, paper mache, French needle modeling, wax, composition, cloth, and felt. Since 1963, her faces were made of a special formula of hardened felt with hand-painted features and inserted eyelashes. The bodies are fully wired and are covered with cloth or felt. A collector of antique dolls, Elizabeth had commented to her daughter that if they got any more expensive, she would have to make her own. On Mother's Day, she received 25 pounds of clay and some tools from that very daughter. And in Elizabeth's words, she was the least likely to do anything with a gob of clay. And nothing, she decided, could be more aggravating than trying to find a place to stow away and forget 25 pounds of clay in a house already so full that a postcard in the mail caused a storage problem. From clay, she studied the composition of wax and came up with her own formula. She learned to make molds from Ada Odenreiter, who also gave her a crash course in pouring, cleaning, firing, painting, and glazing. Elizabeth created limited editions of her dolls in bisque. Eunice created dollhouse-sized children scaled 1 inch to the foot. They represent modern boys and girls, both black and white, or children from famous paintings such as Renoir, Goya, and Velázquez. Her precise craftsmanship lends great elegance to her miniatures. Renee's dolls are made of the finest porcelain and painted with imported Dresden china paints. The heads and lower arms are porcelain, the bodies are muslin and stuffed with cotton. June loved unusual antique dolls and was a serious collector. Eventually, she was inspired to work on her own original creations and started making dolls out of cast plastic and carved wood. When there was a doll shortage during World War II, Claire made cloth dolls to be sold in stores to be given to children in hospitals and to raise funds for charities. In the 1950s, she began making portrait dolls and famous people, first in ceramics and then in porcelain. A portion of any proceeds from the sale of her dolls was given to charities like the Salvation Army and children's homes. While studying painting, Ada was introduced to a puppet head, which inspired her to make one of her own. Then she made a smaller head, which she made into a doll. Her true interest was costuming, so she sometimes made porcelain reproduction dolls to serve as mannequins. In 1969, the Standards Committee was handling over 100 applications a year. Rules had to be changed. Deweese added a strong qualification. Limit this group to those who actually carve, model, or mold the complete doll, or even original rag dolls of merit. Hold exhibitions whenever possible and try to have juries of artists, painters and sculptors, not other doll artists. A candidate was now required to get recommendations from 3 NIADA artists to be considered. They had grown to 50 members. Irma created miniature dolls, some only 1 5/8 inches tall. They weren't difficult, she said, they just took time. I devote all the time possible to dolls in the daytime, and at night carry the doll work to bed, turn on the TV, and work till 11 or so. Sometimes I find myself dozing with the doll in one hand and needle and thread in the other. Joyce started out collecting and restoring antique dolls. It took her 2 years to find the best materials and techniques required to duplicate the fine antique process of the dolls she admired. Her dolls' heads and hands, and sometimes legs and bodies, are of high-fired porcelain. Mirren began making soft toys for fun. As her skills improved, the toys became more detailed. A Scottish craft center wanted quality dolls representing Scottish women in occupational costumes, which she created. She supplied the center for 2 years. She continued to make ethnic dolls based on meticulous research, developing her method of construction, which starts with a wire armature and no arms. Roberta's father hated the fact that when she was a child, she had only white dolls. Once he removed the pink and white bisque head and hands from a brand new doll and molded black ones to replace them. As an adult, teaching history to her 4th grade class, she knew she could dramatize Black history for her students with dolls. She didn't know then that she was beginning a whole new career. At a ceramic show, she bought some doll molds, including some by Maggie Head. Porcelain became her medium. She soon began creating her own originals and chose the general subject of famous Black Americans. The head and hands are molded of colored porcelain with painted features, and the rest of the bodies are cloth stuffed with sawdust. Beverly was NIADA's first freewheeling experimenter in modern materials such as plastics, silicone rubber, plush fabrics, and so on. She designed plush toys, figurines, and home decor products for the toy and gift trade. Born in Germany, Herta's dolls are solid personalities who usually exhibit frailties. Many things influenced her point of view, including her experience during the war years and the final catastrophe of being bombed out and homeless. She made dolls and teddy bears using rags and old draperies given to her by friends who had not been bombed. While her medium is felt, the heads are modeled individually of wood composition and painted. Growing up in Queens, New York, Rose loved the variety of people in her neighborhood: organ grinders, street peddlers, gardeners, the blacksmith, the butchers. Now long gone, these people are immortalized in her loving caricatures. This piece is of longtime NIADA patron Bernie Kaufman. She modeled the heads, hands, legs, and feet from air-dry clay over a heavy wire armature. Fred and his brothers carved everything, their mother's soap, as well as soapstone and chalk deposit from near their home. They made all their own toys with their pocket knives. He went on to do match carving on antique furniture. The loss of 2 fingers in a mining accident and the discovery that he had muscular dystrophy made him more determined to succeed at his art. He met Louis Sorensen in 1969, who introduced him to the world of dolls. He enjoyed making dolls representing artists at their easels with paint tubes and brushes, all carved to scale, and wood carvers and other craftsmen at their benches. He spent many years carving large groups of religious figures. Francis's historical figures were used as teaching aids. To achieve lifelike posture and freedom of movement, she designed wooden bodies to scale, which she turned on a lathe. Faces and hands were carved from Alaskan cedar. She chose fabrics that would show, in miniature, the same texture and draping qualities of the original. Marianne made her first doll in 3rd grade and a year later attended classes at an endowed art school for gifted students. She worked in several mediums over the years and found she was good at restoration work. She bought a kiln and experimented with bisque dolls. In 1962, she had created 2 original porcelain dolls. She created 3 that have fine kid bodies that were made with precision, and this is one of them. Frank and Elizabeth have always worked as a team. Frank, a gifted sculptor, shaped the figures from a durable composition. Elizabeth researched, designed, and made the costumes, painted the faces, and made the wigs. In 1972, NIADA published Helen's monograph, Dorothy Heiser, The Artist and Her Dolls. This was designed as a guide for artists to follow when creating a complete record of their own work. It was an important testament to the work of a doll artist. Judith experimented with many media, mostly ceramic clay and porcelain, and learned to make plastic molds. Her own spirit of fun can be seen in her dolls, giving them a vibrant life of their own. Much like the Hayneses, Guy designed and modeled the heads and hands and sketched the bodies. Virginia took over to complete the sewing, stuffing, and support of the torso, then followed the sketches and doodles that Guy had turned over to her for the design of the costumes. Herb had been doing portrait sculpture for many years, but in life-size or larger. He was asked to make a pouting head for a doll, and the idea of making dolls appealed to him. He found the American Doll Artist book and learned about contemporary doll artists. He began to write to them and received advice and encouragement from Astrid Campbell and Maggie Head and Louise Cochran, who lived nearby. Primarily, he wanted his dolls to reflect life as in this piece, Louise Cochran working on a doll. On the day of Margaret Hoag's unanimous election to NIADA membership, she tragically died in a plane crash, which also destroyed her many dolls she was bringing. This doll, which had been sent ahead, remained for the voting. Her dolls were carved from butternut wood and most had peg joints. Hair was either painted or made from flax grown on the family farm. Early experimentation with hollyhock ladies, soap people, corn shuck dolls, and applehead dolls led Laura to developing more serious work of fine kidskin over molded plastic wood heads. She meticulously knitted the small costumes with needles made from piano wire. Frances learned to sew as a little girl, and Jacques was a professor of art, a painter, and a poet. Together they made art dolls that were haute couture in miniature. The absence of defined facial features was intentional and was an invitation for the viewer to imagine the personality. Elizabeth chose to make art dolls because she wanted to use color, movement, and variations of theme. Articulation of her figures gave her the freedom to vary poses and moods. She worked in various media. Karen focused on creating an emotional response with her dolls. They are silent storytellers, teachers of history, or evoke memories or emotions. Helen's second book, The American Doll Artist, Volume 2, was published in 1975, 10 years after the first. A definition of an acceptable NIADA doll was given. It was to first have an artistic intention, second, show a high degree of craftsmanship in the control of materials and techniques, and third, convey a message to the beholder. Whether direct carved wood or cloth, Maggie's one-of-a-kind figures began with a moment of inspiration. She described the process of creation as the glow of pleasure from making, putting all kinds of bits and pieces together, to ending with something that is first time in this world. June amazed herself by sculpting a likeness of her uncle from her daughter's Play-Doh. Wanting to save it, she researched mold making and taught herself doll making processes. Intrigued by local Native American Indians, she started researching them and creating figures in their likeness. Faith began her sculpting career in the early 60s. Her forte is creating characters from nursery rhymes, folk and fairy tales, Christmas, and the circus. She began a cottage industry to produce her work in porcelain and called her company Wicked Originals, Inc. In 1991, she formed a new company, Faith Wick Creations, that made and sold dolls to retail outlets. As a teenager, Cecilia was already making jointed figures of wood. Later, she developed an interest in marionettes, both the figures and the plays. Her porcelain figures of historical people were carefully researched, and you can see their personality and character in their poses, costumes, and accessories. Her favorite method was to cast a generic head in porcelain and then carve and model directly in the porcelain clay until she had exactly the character she had in mind. Each one is a truly thoughtful work of art from her own hand. In Chicago, on June 11, 1977, NIADA held their 15th annual exhibition. The special feature was a retrospective on Deweese Cochran and Louis Sorensen. The criteria for a NIADA artist doll was printed in their program. In order to be a NIADA artist doll, a figure must follow the same rules that govern the creation of any piece of art. In sculpture, it is form, movement, balance, anatomy, modeling, etc. In painting, it is color, harmony, brush technique, expression, and so on. A doll combines sculpture and painting and tests the resources of the artist in combining fabrics for clothing, scaling proportions, and most importantly, in having the freestanding figure deliver a message, some aspect of American culture. Martha earned her living at various ventures until being hired by Mattel, where she sculpted many of the company's popular dolls. Known as a meticulous sculptor and a generous, inspiring teacher, she once said, "Recreating the essence of life in three-dimensional form is still my reason for living." Anne's strong interest in portraiture was reflected in her fiberglass resin figures representing well-known English notables. After being elected to NIADA, she recognized the need for professional organization in her own country and founded the British Doll Artists Association in 1980. Elizabeth developed a technique that combined traditional cloth dolls with the modeled dolls. She used a cloth-constructed figure as the base for a direct sculpted composition. Carol was elected to NIADA just 2 years after making her first needle-sculpted cloth dolls. She advanced to oil-painted cloth and other mediums. She was curious to try every modern approach to doll making: soft and hardened cloth, wax, Fimo, Cernit, and resin. Patty made her first doll with pine scraps left over from building her own house. Her techniques were refined as she created a variety of one-of-a-kind portrait dolls, renderings of old dolls, and wooden versions of cloth folk art dolls. Carol was first known for her lifelike dollhouse dolls, made from her own composition mixture. As her dolls grew a bit larger, she began to work with Super Sculpey. The figures evolved in several ways. She realized she was trying to create works of art which had to stay put on bases. Robert started making clothes for his toys when he was about 5 years old. He started collecting dolls when he purchased a clothespin doll by Bernie Ravka. He developed his own patterns in a doll-making style that featured hand-sewn cloth painted with oils. There are no gallery images of Diane Wheeler's work or a biography. Deweese Cochran set up a fund to help aspiring artists perfect their skills. The response was overwhelming, not for money, but for workshops. This was the other half of the equation. Show people what artist dolls are and then teach them how to make them. Elizabeth started out carving wooden dolls and evolved into making figures of porcelain. She had no formal art training, so she had no restraints. Once she found her medium, her drive with her porcelain doll work was toward realism and crafting of complex enough joints so that expressive positioning could be attained. When Eleanor first learned about artist dolls, she tried making some of her own, first using polyform clay and later working in porcelain. Norma developed a method of working in cloth where she needle sculpted knit fabric, hardened it with glue, and covered that with a second fabric layer, which was sized with paste and painted with oils. Janice did not want her dolls to be figures, but real dolls that could be positioned, undressed, and played with. Her delicate porcelain dolls had spring-strung joints and gusseted kid-skin bodies. She even made miniature lace. In 1976, John decided to try his hand at doll making, and he began to sew a crude figure, his first doll, out of the only fabric at hand, a piece of yellow flannel. John had never sewn anything before, but this first effort seemed to hold much potential. Before the doll was completed, John was already thinking of the improvements he would make on the second one. 1 year after making his first doll, John sculpted the faces which would become the first molded felt dolls from R. John Wright. In 1978, the character dolls were introduced. Their sculptural, hand-painted faces and detailed costumes and accessories brought a new level of sophistication to his work. Best known for her carved basswood dolls, Patricia also worked with composition and porcelain based on children and real people she observed. Both a partner in collaboration with her mother, Margaret Finch, and a respected individual artist, Marta also worked in more than one medium. She created direct carved, fully articulated wooden figures, and then expanded to creating the head and limbs from super sculpey. Finished figures were costumed by her mother. Since its inception, the Institute, NIADA, has worked to establish the artist doll as a piece of fine art. As a young woman, Arlen became a puppeteer and a marionette maker. Her creations were praised for their clarity of line, texture, and color. Later, she created miniature dolls from synthetic clays and wax. Best known for her vinyl dolls, Helen is also adept in one-of-a-kind clay sculptures, figurative bronzes, and limited edition porcelain dolls. Susanna's art, close to 500 pieces in collections around the world, was noted for whimsy and the avant-garde in figures. She is probably most known for her 60-piece, one-of-a-kind Mulliner family series. She made up an elaborate family tree and a basic story for each one. Owners became members of the Mulliner Family Conservancy. She also wrote several books on doll making. A cloth doll artist, Ellen's figures represented her Appalachian heritage, and her style relied on the elongated line and articulated fingers. Edna's porcelain and cloth-bodied doll reflects the style of the 80s. Michael's wood carving technique is extremely labor-intensive. In his long doll-making career, fewer than 100 pieces were produced. Lisa creates the illusion of flesh by mimicking nature, basically using materials that feel and behave like what they represent. Bones are made with wire shaped by heavy felt. Muscles, simulated by batting, are attached to the bones in the correct anatomical way, making a perfect frame for the fiberfill and nylon that beautifully simulates skin. Robert enjoyed puppetry as a hobby until he discovered the world of doll making through Helen Bullard's books. Working in Sculpey and eventually paperclay, Bob created rich and often poignant characters. Bob was also a generous teacher who wrote several books on doll making. After working as a makeup artist and costumer for the stage, Antoinette started making cloth dolls which incorporated all of her skills, reducing them to a small scale. Ken carved his first doll around 1983, encouraged by his wife Norma, who designed all the costumes for his dolls. The accurate sculpting and costuming of Charlotte's dolls reflect her training as an historian, as well as the skills she acquired doing painting and illustration. Patron members and associate members are very important parts of the NIADA community. They actively support the art of the original handmade doll through their involvement and efforts. A pioneer in the art doll movement, Akira participated in the elevation of the doll from toy to art object. Her early cloth dolls are recognizable by her unique style, even as her work evolved to incorporate wood and other natural materials. Robert worked in the fashion industry for 18 years, when in 1991 he made a career change and founded the Tonner Doll Company, now a world-renowned collectible doll company. Carla tried several mediums for her dolls before determining that cloth over composition heads and stuffed cloth bodies would allow her to achieve the lifelike expressions and posable figures that she wanted. In 1992, a third NIADA book, The Art of the Doll: Contemporary Works of the National Institute of American Doll Artists, was published, documenting the active artist membership at that time. Diana worked in the doll industry for over 40 years. Although she worked with vinyl for many years, her reputation as a master and mentor of porcelain will remain undisputed. After retirement, Dorothy moved to Alaska, where she began a successful career as a doll artist. She had a deep interest in native cultures and began making miniatures, then porcelain dolls and detailed dollhouses. Her dolls range from 1/12 scale to life-size dolls over 5 feet tall. Jody and Richard have designed dolls together since 1977. Their mutual appreciation of customs and traditions from the world's varied ethnic groups has given them a rich palette of characters. A miniature porcelain doll artist, Jane has also honed her skills as a woodworker, including carving and wood turning, to make settings that greatly enhance her storytelling. Bill is an award-winning illustrator and is recognized as a sculptor and ventriloquist maker. His one-of-a-kind figures and automata have made their way into the private collections of many celebrities. Although her first dolls were direct sculpted in porcelain, Nancy experimented with polymer and paper clays and worked in all three mediums. Charlene began making dolls at the age of 60. Working first in porcelain, she soon turned to fabric over composition, which she treated as a canvas, painting in the manner of an oil portrait. A master carver and former woodshop instructor, Floyd delights in carving wooden dolls. A peg-jointed Victorian-style doll became his first doll in 1978 while attempting to illustrate to his students that something beautiful could be carved from wood. Lenore began her career as a ceramicist and turned to fiber arts in 1969. The rich painting of her fabric was an important aspect of her work. Elizabeth's dolls have a remarkable range in type, size, and materials. Here, her humorous maximum-size figure is rendered in minimum color. Susan's miniature work represents a simple moment in time, a short dialogue between the figures themselves, or an interaction between the viewer and the figure. For more than 60 years, George Stewart has been capturing the essence of history's most famous and infamous personalities in his highly realistic historical figures. Each subject is extensively researched and created in exacting detail. Dollmaking became an obsession with Maggie. The need to learn and constantly invent new ways of perfecting the doll was a powerful driving force. With the wonderful combination of sculpture and textiles, Maggie's dolls possess multiple joints, allowing the collector to position the figure to their own imagination. In EJ's own words, "For me, the main thing is the work. It must be perfect. I always make sure that what I do is good. When the artist completes the work, it must speak for itself, independent of the author. You need to be sure that when the work is complete, it has its own voice." Lillian, who was only able to be involved in NIADA for a very short time, sculpted lyrical fantasy pieces from paper clay. Scott finds it amusing to assemble dissimilar objects but not to spoil the period silhouette. And Shelley takes cloth to a whole new level with her mastery of pattern mixing and her stuffed hair and accessories. Is there any way to compare artists and doll artists with strong individual styles and media except to say, this I like, this is perfection of its kind, and especially this has something to say to me? Mary Ellen's familiarity with indigenous people of Alaska inspire her wood-carved figures. Gail's goth kids, with their goth toys, are still little children playing with toys. Sylvia's little children have hauntingly beautiful faces, and Connie brings anthropomorphic dolls to the table. Known for making funny faces and outrageous characters, here is Annie's aging Playboy bunny. 1997 brought 17 new artists and a variety of mediums and personalities. Charles creates figures that represent the human condition frozen in time on the world stage. Husband and wife team Chris Chomick and Peter Meter create a unique form of figurative art and automata. Jürgen and Huve's stylized sculptures of wood, porcelain, and paperclay changed our view of the wood figures we had seen to date. Sherry's dolls are characterized by her finely detailed and realistic sculpting style. Adnan sculpted everything with one tool. His anthropomorphic figures often poked fun at the customs of 17th and 18th century nobility. It is not Henny's intention to create the reality of human form. They exist in their own dimension. And Axel's graceful forms and soft palette evoke an ethereal quality. Heather's sweet little children are the kids we want. Anne's are the kids we got. Using the body as a canvas, Marilyn transforms the sculpted piece with layers of fabric, nature's elements, and found objects. Lynn will start working on a head, and then Michael works on it. All of their pieces are wholly collaborative. Joellen's toes dipped in the anthropomorphic water as well. Her fantastical figures are hand-painted in her unique style. Catherine's dolls all have a touch of whimsy, along with clean colors and lines. Nancy's work is set apart by intentional, visible brushstrokes on both the body and the costume, as if they were paintings. We are a close-knit, far-flung group of solitary individualists. Where Ronnie's marionettes exhibit a multitude of brightly colored personalities in wood, the absence of color is expressive on the faces of Pamela's dolls. Both Yunko and Kyoko create dolls costumed like their own folk, in Japanese dress. Tatiana's sculpt is expressive realism. Costuming actually enhances the sculpt, where Stephanie's exquisite costuming is part of the overall design. Dan's pieces are full of expressive movement in washi paper, while the gentle spirit of Ella's doll is captured in the eyes. Donna Mae creates uniquely expressive faces in oil paint over cloth, while Marlene sculpts fantasy figures with expressive faces in paper clay. Where NIADA once focused on American artists making dolls that reflect their lives and culture, there is now a focus on the universal expression inherent in art dolls. Diane's meticulous design in the Hanfu style of ancient Chinese dress gives this doll a refined look. Emma's stylized fluid figures are expressive and elegant. The quiet expression on Sandra's doll's face is reflected in her color palette. And Natalia's monochromatic doll is rich in variations of the same color. Anki's dolls are identifiable by her creative and innovative costuming. Leslie's love of bright colors comes out in a playfulness in all of her designs. And Forrest's piece can take you on a flight of the imagination. The doll artist sits in her studio creating something new for her collectors, or should we say patrons, for we view them as more than collectors. They are patrons of the arts, patrons that allow us to do what we love most, make dolls. Having collaborated with his wife Akira by creating wood pieces for her dolls, Larry discovered his own style in wood carving. Tomoko brought another side of Japanese culture, a very realistic interpretation in cloth of a grandmother in day attire. Tina creates beautiful fairies in soft colors and flowing movement. Catherine's beautifully realistic figures can be from different times in history, fairies, or storybook characters. And Norma was the costumer for all of her husband Ken's dolls. Storytelling in cloth is a specialty of Leslie's, and the story here is in the hat. Raina brought an entirely new technique to the ever-growing garden of design, knitted wire over clay. Pat's otherworldly sculpts are both beautiful and supernatural. Olga's sculpts have incredible movement and balance, and she finishes them with a special hand painting technique that mimics airbrush. Kate's quirky, Cirque-inspired figures are sculpted in polymer and are bent and stretched into whimsical poses. Deborah creates imaginative needle-felted anthropomorphic figures that are costumed with fabric. In 2009, NIADA Art Dolls, Rich Traditions, New Ideas was published featuring the work of every NIADA artist elected from 1963 to 2008. Amanda refers to her polymer figures as pretty monsters. Moonyoung's doll wears a native costume from Korea. Jill discovered that storytelling is critical to any creative endeavor, including her polymer character dolls. Svetlana's dolls are her passion. She says, "They are the most important part of my creative side. They overtook all my other art interests." And Alina's felted characters capture the everyday moments in our lives. Anna's adorable faces on her little people will win your heart. Tanya is the first artist to create a full piece that was 3D printed. Nina's endearing figures seem to have an old soul, like they have been here before. It remains NIADA's mission to present the work of its members as art. This is visually one of my favorite pages. From Susan's incredible little cloth doll to the hand-built clay forms by Victoria Rose, to the willowy stylized porcelain figures by Tamara, to the carved wood historical doll by Vita, 4 different mediums interpreted in 4 different ways with one constant, the doll as art. You can see a little bit of Neva's mischief in all of her dolls, and they all seem to tell a story. Anna's figures all have a thoughtful look, as if they are recalling a special memory. My figures are noted for their elongated bodies with a nod to high fashion. And Karen's dolls are paperclay creations with costumes made from paper. Teresa is noted for her incredible costume design and execution. Dustin's ability to sculpt a variety of characters is seen in this realistic sculpt of the Dowager from Downton Abbey. Eva has a way to carve wood to make it look and feel soft. Joe creates character dolls as well as fashion dolls. And Luella's Cirque-inspired wax-over paperclay pieces are hauntingly beautiful. Joy costumes her dolls primarily in shades of white. By contrast, Anna's felt dolls are ripe with color. Anastasia has an eye for color, and her costume is remarkably rich in both color and incredible fabrics. Inga uses white or adds just one color to create her stylized, expressive sculpts. Juliet's monochromatic pieces are both beautiful and haunting. You feel that they have seen a lot for their young age. Christine's are full of color and design. Her pieces are known for their three-dimensional accents to both the clothing and accessories. Oksana makes dolls that appear timeless, achieving harmony by combining lines, materials, and construction. The variety of personal styles and the imaginative use of materials seems to be continually expanding. Sisters Anna and Maria collaborate on their dolls under the name of Anya Manya. Their dolls are usually a bit overweight, brightly colored, and a little bit sassy. Jennifer creates needle-felted sculptures that are full of movement and surprise. In 2022, NIADA Art Dolls Continuing the Tradition was published, highlighting the 31 artists elected from 2009 to 2021. As you can see here, there is always a new note to add to the song. Last year, 4 new artists were elected to artist membership. Anya's dramatic figures are enhanced with her use of color. Karen introduced gourds as a new doll art medium. Gourds can be folks too. Megan's work is anthropomorphic but with a dark twist, and Nadia's black underpainting style is fresh and unique. Doll making evolves as our minds and experiences continue to grow. Congratulations to Renata and Anne. Both were voted in as NIADA Artist Members in 2023. What started with a hand-carved mountain girl doll has grown into a full-fledged worldwide organization of artist-made dolls of every medium we know of today. We look forward to the next 60 years. Thank you to Helen Bullard for her vision in recognizing the doll as art, documenting and cataloging information about her contemporary artists and their dolls in an effort to bring awareness and legitimacy to this art form. To Shelley Thornton for her extensive work on the last 3 NIADA books which helped provide content here. And to the NIADA artists from 1963 to 2023 whose talent and hard work have made Helen's vision a reality. And thank you for joining us.